Hi, I'm Megan.
And I'm Michelle. And I don't know anything about property taxes in Nevada, but Megan has studied up on the subject. So I want her to walk me through what's going on with Nevada's property tax formula. But first of all, let's talk about this. Why do we need property taxes?
So property taxes go to fund a number of different things. So they're important for your local government, like your county government, to fund the services they provide to you. So that things like police and fire, and they go to fund schools and roads and all these different services that your county provides you. So that's what your property taxes go toward.
Now the problem is when the economy is going so well and property taxes are rising really quickly, then that means your property tax bill could shoot up really quickly and be jump up from year to year. So that's why the legislature decided to put caps into place.
They did. So in 2005, during the housing boom, prices were great. They were skyrocketing. Everything was going really well. The legislature decided to put caps on property tax bills. They basically didn't want homeowners to be facing 20% increases on their property tax bills year over year. They put these caps in place. But back in 2005, there's no way they could have known that the recession was coming. So now county governments say that there's these unintended consequences that have happened because of those caps that have resulted in stagnating revenues for the county, which makes them unable to provide services that you enjoy, like police and fire and schools and everything we just talked about.
So Megan, how would the state determine a property tax cap that's going to apply to my home?
So there are two basic ways that property tax caps are calculated. So these are caps on the increase on your property taxes year over year. So if you're paying $100 one year, it may be a $3 increase on your bill the next year. If you're paying a $400 bill, it'd be the equivalent amount percentage-wise. So there are two different ways that these are calculated. One of the ways is a 10-year average of the assessed valuation of homes. And so basically that's a fancy way of saying how much home prices have generally increased over the past 10 years. So as you can imagine, going back before the recession, if you have 10 years of home prices are going up and up and up, that's going to be a pretty big number. But what's happened is over the past 10 years, this is 2017, you go back 10 years, that's 2007, the start of the recession, housing prices have been falling. So that's actually been kind of a dwindling number. It's been getting smaller and smaller.
So if you average the last 10 years, it's not a good group of 10 years.
Nope. It's been a lot of hard years for property values. And so even though there's been some recovery, that 10-year period includes sort of those bad recession years where properties were, decreasing in value. So that's one of the ways we calculate it. So the other way we calculate it is based off of something called the Consumer Price Index. And that's basically a fancy way of saying, how much inflation there's been in the economy, how much goods cost this year compared to what they cost last year. So that's a number that's calculated, it's a set number. And so we take that number and we do twice that number. And that's another way that we calculate property tax increases. So for example, last year, the increase in the Consumer Price Index was 0.1%. So 2 times that would have been 0.2%. And that's actually what the property tax increase cap is this year, is 0.2%. And that's for Clark County. It depends based on what county you're in. Some counties, have different calculations and it pans out a little bit differently there. But most of the counties in the state faced a 0.2% property tax increase cap this year.
So if my assessor said the value of my home increased by 5%, would my property tax bill go up 5% this year?
No. So because there's that 0.2% cap, it can only go up by 0.2% at the most. An assessor could still come to your house and say, no, actually your property's, value has gone down. So you actually need to pay a little bit less this year. They could say there's no change. But that cap basically means that it just can't go up by more than that. Your property tax bill won't increase by more than that cap that's set.
More than 0.2% this year.
That's correct.
Now tell me how we would calculate it based on the 10-year assessed valuation.
Yeah, so that's the tricky part, is that this year we didn't use the 10-year assessed valuation because, again, those property taxes were going down. So this year, the 10-year average assessed valuation was actually a negative number. It was negative 2.7%. So we obviously can't use that as a cap on an increase since it's a negative number. So that's why we went with the CPI number. But that hasn't always been the case in past years. Sometimes the average assessed valuation has been 12.6%, it's been 15.7%, these really big numbers. And that's why the property tax caps were put in place in the first place. So we talked about the two ways that they're calculated, the assessed valuation calculation and then the Consumer Price Index calculation. But the biggest part of what the legislature put in place in 2005 were these solid caps on both residential and commercial property taxes.
So that's if both the assessed valuation is going up really quickly and so is the consumer price index.
Exactly.
Going up way fast, and the legislature wanted to put the brakes on that.
Exactly. So basically they said, you look at your 10-year assessed valuation, you look at your CPI, whichever the bigger of those two numbers is, you stick with that. So back in 2006, the 10-year average assessed valuation was 12.6. CPI was 2.7%, which means that 2 times CPI calculation was 5.4%. So you would have taken the bigger of those two numbers, the 12.6%. But because that number exceeds the 3% residential cap and the 8% commercial cap, the property taxes for both of those would have been capped back in 2006. So your residential property taxes increases could not have exceeded 3%, and the ones on commercial property taxes could not have exceeded 8%.
So regardless of anything, the state has a big fat 3% cap on home price increases, or property tax increases every year.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about what's called a floor?
Yes.
Counties want there to be a floor.
Yep. And so that's the big question that's come out of this, is because you had a negative 10-year average assessed valuation, that negative 2.7 number we talked about, and then CPI times 2 was only 0.2%. Counties say that they have seen stagnating revenues and they're not able to provide services that make up or match with the growth that they're seeing in their counties.
They never thought things would get this low.
They did not. So basically, the counties are asking for the legislature to create a floor on those property tax caps. So this is where it gets kind of confusing. We're talking about a property tax cap, which means that your property tax bill cannot increase by that percent. We've already talked about the ceiling on that cap. Now we're talking about a floor on that very same cap. So originally, the counties asked for a 3% floor to be created, which basically wouldn't ever allow this situation where we have a 0.2% property tax increase. The minimum by which the amount could be capped is 3%. Now this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because right now for residential property taxes, the ceiling on the cap is 3%, but the legislature also wants to create a floor which would also be 3%. That would have the impact of it always being 3%. So the cap, no matter what, for residential property taxes would be 3%. Again, that's not to say that your property taxes would always go up by 3%. Sometimes it could go up by 1%, it could go up by no percent, it could actually go down. Those are all possibilities.
Because your assessor could come and say your property value increased by 1%. Your property tax should increase by 1% this year.
Exactly.
That's within 3%,
Yep.
so we can do that.
Yep. It doesn't mean that they're always increasing it by 3%. So that's the big difference. Now, where this will actually make a difference is with those commercial property taxes. So again, we talked about the fact that the ceiling on those caps is 8% for commercial property taxes. So this would also create that floor. So there'd be that 3% floor for commercial property taxes. So that would mean that your increase for property taxes on commercial properties would always be between 3 and 8%. So again, you'd go back to those 10-year average assessed valuation calculations, the CPI times 2 calculations. That would give you your two numbers, and then somewhere in between 3 and 8%, that's what the commercial property tax value would be calculated at. And that's happened in the past. Back in 2012, the residential property tax was 3%, and the commercial property tax was 6.8%. So you could have another situation like that where it's not necessarily an 8% cap. It could be somewhere in between 3 and 8.
Megan, I think it's totally clear to me now what's going on with property tax in Nevada. Thank you so much for explaining.
I'm glad. The end.
Bye.
Woo.